The Harlem Renaissance was a cultural movement that spanned the 1920s. At the time, it was known as the New Negro Movement. Though it was centered in Harlem, a neighborhood of New York, many French-speaking black writers from African and Caribbean colonies who lived in Paris were also influenced by the Harlem Renaissance. The African Americans used art to prove their humanity and demand for equality. The Harlem Renaissance led to more opportunities for blacks to be published by mainstream houses. Many authors began to publish novels, magazines, and newspapers during this time. The new fiction attracted a great amount of attention from the nation at large. Some authors who became nationally known were Zora Neale Hurston and Langston Hughes. The first stage of the Harlem Renaissance started in the late 1910s. 1917 saw the premiere of the 3 plays for a Negro theater. These plays, written by playwright Ridgely Torrance, featured African-American actors conveying complex human emotions and yearnings. They rejected the stereotypes of the blackface and minstrel show traditions. A new way of playing the piano, called the Harlem Stride style, was created during the Harlem Renaissance and helped blur the lines between the poor Negroes and socially elite Negroes. During the time period, the musical style of blacks was becoming more and more attractive to whites. White novelists, dramatists, and composers started to exploit the musical tendencies and themes of African Americans in their work.
Prohibition in the United States was a national ban on the sale, production, and transportation of alcohol that took place from 1920 to 1933. The Dry movement was led by rural Protestants in both political parties, was coordinated by the Anti-Saloon League. The ban was mandated by the 18th Amendment, and the Volstead Act set down the rules for enforcing the ban and defined the types of alcohol beverages that were prohibited. Anti-prohibitionists, or WETs, criticized the alcohol ban as an intrusion of mainly rural Protestant ideals on a central aspect of urban, immigrant, and Catholic everyday life. Effective enforcement of the alcohol ban during the Prohibition era proved to be very difficult and led to widespread flouting of the law. The lack of a solid popular consensus for the ban resulted in the growth of vast criminal organizations, including the modern American Mafia, and various other criminal cliques. Widespread disregard of the law also generated rampant corruption among politicians and within police forces.
Organized crime received a major boost from the Prohibition. Mafia groups limited their activities to prostitution, gambling, and theft up until the 1920s, when organized bootlegging emerged in response to the effect of the Prohibition. A profitable, often violent black market for alcohol flourished. Powerful criminal gangs corrupted law enforcement agencies, leading to racketeering. In essence, Prohibition provided a financial basis for organized crime to flourish, thus leading to the end of the Prohibition. In the 1920s, the way people in the U.S. ate changed. In the late teens, they were told to conserve food for the war. Many people called this food conservation. Food was asked to be kept and donated to the military in order to feed our troops and our allies in World War I. Some key parts of this campaign were to conserve food, including meatless Mondays and wheatless Wednesdays. When the 1920s came around, food conservation was a little less of a concern, and people began to indulge in the joys of life, including alcohol and lots of rich food.
During the 1920s, modernism became the norm in the art world. Modern art is a representation of the world that is less than literal. Photography had been invented, so there was no need for realistic paintings anymore. Artists began coming up with new ways to show how they viewed the world. Beneath the umbrella of modernism, surrealism tries to express the true function of thought, defying all logic and lies outside any normal or moral interpretations of life. Surrealists had a vivid imagination and were extensively creative. Advertising in the 1920s reflected the wealth of a nation and the optimism that science was on the verge of a golden age. Advertisers were beginning to figure out what worked and what didn't, and their enthusiastic advertising copies would attempt to sway even the most incredulous purchases. Cigarette ads in the 1920s were bold in colors and vintage fonts. They boast that cigarettes can help us stay thin, cure cough, and digest our food. They won't irritate our throats, make our voices raspy, or affect our athletic performance. In essence, they wanted you to believe that they were actually good for you.
Religion, like much of American culture, took a sharp turn during the 1920s. America had for the past 3 or 4 decades been working on its way to modernism, and now that it had arrived there, many innovations and controversies in all areas of life, including religion, had been made. Within Protestant faith, the greatest controversy was the split between fundamentalists and modernists. Fundamentalists were American citizens who clung tight to traditional views of Protestantism. They believe in high moral code and the literal translation of the Bible. Fundamentalists were generally located in rural areas of the country. A key point in fundamentalist doctrine was the theory of creationism, the idea that God created the universe in 7 days, as stated in the book of Genesis. Fundamentalists generally tended to blame liberals and modernists for causing a decline in the morals that characterized the Jazz Age. The ideas of fundamentalism rose to extremes in certain areas of the country, and in the South, an extremist group called the Ku Klux Klan came into power. For modernists, many of the new scientific and social changes, like social gospel, women's rights, and scientific discoveries, prompt many Protestants to break off from traditional religious ideals to interpret their faith differently. Modernists had a critical, historical, and scientific views of many of the passages of the Bible. Many believed that they could accept the Darwinism theory of evolution without compromising their religious faith. Artists such as King Oliver, Louis Armstrong, Kid Ory, and Duke Ellington defined the Jazz Age in the United States. African American jazz culture has an amazing influence upon the culture in the 1920s due to the ability of these recordings to white, upper middle class listeners. Jazz music influenced all aspects of society. Jazz poetry, fashion, and industry were affected by the basement music that took the United States by storm. Jazz music also reduced the racial tension between the post-war period.
The 1920s is a decade in which the fashion industry entered the modern era. It was a decade in which women first abandoned the more restricting fashions of past years and began to wear more comfortable clothes such as short skirts or trousers. Men also abandoned highly formal daily attire and even began to wear athletic clothing for the first time. The suits men wear today are still based, for the most part, on those worn in the late 1920s. The 1920s are characterized by two distinct periods of fashion. In the early part of the decade, change was slow, as many were reluctant to adopt new styles. From 1925, the public passionately embraced the styles associated with the Roaring Twenties. These styles continued to characterize fashion until early in 1932. The technological development of new fabrics and new closures in clothing affected fashions of 1920s. Natural fabrics such as cotton and wool were abundant fabrics of the decade. Silk was highly desired for its luxurious qualities, but the limited supply made it expensive. In the late 19th century, artificial silk was made from a solution of cellulose in France. After being patented in the United States, the first American plant began production of this new fabric in 1910. This fabric became known as rayon. Rayon stockings became popular in the decade as substitute for silk stockings. Rayon was also used in some undergarments. Many undergarments before the 1920s were fastened with buttons and lacing. However, during this decade, the development of metal hooks and eyes meant that there were easier means of fastening clothing shut. Hooks and eyes, buttons, zippers, or snaps were all utilized to fasten clothing. Although society matrons of a certain age continued to wear conservative dresses, the sportswear worn by forward-looking and younger women became the greatest change in post-war fashion. The tubular dresses of teens that had evolved into the similar silhouette that now sported shorter skirts with pleats, gathers, or slits to allow motion. In menswear, there were two distinct periods in the 1920s. Throughout the decade, men wore shorts, suit jackets, the old long jackets being used merely for formal occasions. In the early 1920s, men's fashion was characterized by extremely high-waisted jackets, often worn with belts. Lapels on suit jackets were not very wide as they tended to be buttoned up high. This style of jacket seems to have been greatly influenced by the uniforms worn by the military during the First World War. Trousers were relatively narrow and straight, and they were worn rather short so that a man's socks often showed. Trousers also began to be worn cuffed at the bottom at this very time. Men's hats were usually worn depending on their class, with upper-class citizens usually wearing top hats or a Humbert hat. Middle-class men wore either a fedora, bowler hat, or trilby hat. During the summer months, a straw boater was popular for upper class and middle class men. Working class men wore a standard newsboy cap or a flat cap.
Al Capone is America's best-known gangster and the single greatest symbol of collapse of law and order in the United States during the 1920s Prohibition era. Capone had a leading role in the illegal activities that lent Chicago its reputation as a lawless city. Capone was born January 17, 1899 in Brooklyn, New York. Baptized Alphonsus Capone, he grew up in a rough neighborhood and was a member of two kid gangs, the Brooklyn Rippers and the 40 Thieves Juniors. Between scams, he was a clerk in a candy store, a pinboy in a bowling alley, a cutter in a bookbindery. He became part of the notorious 5 Point Gang in Manhattan and worked in gangster Frankie Al's Brooklyn Dive, the Harvard Inn, as a bouncer and a bartender. While working at the inn, Capone received his infamous facial scars and the resulting nickname Scarface when he insulted a woman and was attacked by her brother. In 1918, Capone met an Irish girl named Mary May Coughlin at a dance. On December 4th, 1918, May gave birth to their son, Albert Sonny Francis. Capone and May married that year on December 30th. Capone moved to Chicago in 1919 and moved his family into a house at 7244 South Prairie Avenue. Capone went to work for Yale's old mentor, John Torrio. Torrio saw Capone's potential, his combination of physical strength and intelligence, and encouraged his prodigy. Soon Capone was helping Torrio manage his bootlegging business. By mid-1922, Capone ranked as Torrio's number 2 man and eventually became a full partner in the saloons, gambling houses, and brothels. When Torrio was shot by rival gang members, Capone inherited the outfit and became boss. The outfit's men liked, trusted, and obeyed Capone, calling him the Big Fella. Capone's most notorious killing was the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. On February 14, 1929, 4 of Capone's men entered a garage that was the main liquor headquarters of bootlegger George Bugs Moran's North Side Gang. Using 2 shotguns and 2 machine guns, Capone's men fired more than 150 bullets into the victims. 6 of the 7 members of Moran's gang were killed.